The first thing I can recall as a young kid is I had button shoes. No other kid had button shoes. Button shoes were common before the 1920s, and I was wearing button shoes, and I didn't like it. Anyhow. And then growing up from then, I recall getting a tricycle and a bicycle and trips with my parents to New York and to Montreal, going to grade at a high school, making making the high school football team and the baseball team, and then going on to the University of Detroit. And I had roughly almost 2 years in before the war, and I could not sign up with the United States Air Force Cadet Program until I had 2 years of college. In June of '43, I had 2 years of college. I took the test, which was a an intelligence test, which lasted for about an hour and a half, and then a physical, and I passed that. But I didn't have the 2 years into college until the following June. That would have been June of 40, 45, 40, 43. Anyhow, I can recall my dad taking me to the train station in Detroit, which would have been in January, a very cold day in January of 1943. I was very glad to be going. I'd waited for the time that I was qualified until this January, and he understood why I was glad. But I wanted to fly, and this was the route to that position. So yes, we did talk about it. He had been in World War I. He had been born in Ireland. He was with the American forces in World War I, where he became a citizen. And although I was born in Canada, Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario, I was an automatic citizen because my father was a citizen at the time. And the training in Miami Beach was pretty much about the Army, telling us about the Army, a lot of drilling, a lot of ground school as to what it would be like to being an officer, how to behave as an officer. And it was really an indoctrination into the Army, what was expected of us and what they were going to do for us. So, and that lasted about 8 weeks. Nashville, where the qualification process took place between whether you were going to be a pilot, a bombardier, or a navigator. And one of the questions that I got was, did you like your mother? When they were psychologically testing us to find out what kind of questions we could stand. And I said, yeah, I like my mother. Then you want to know why I didn't like her. I told her I didn't like her cooking. But you know, when you're a young kid and you have friends, sometimes you get invited to their house for dinner. And it seems to me that my friends' mothers always prepared a better meal than my own mother did. So that was a very trying condition in the beginning because they'd flash an airplane, it might be a Russian airplane or Japanese or American or English, for 1/25th of a second. And we had to identify who owned that airplane and what the name of it was. It was a very busy place because there are all kinds of cadets, would-be cadets like us, pouring into Nashville for more intelligence tests, psychological tests, and all kinds of dexterity tests. And I liked Nashville very much. It was great. Even from the beginning of the war, I was very much interested in all kinds of airplanes that the French had, that the British had the Spitfires, the Hurricanes, and our own airplanes, the bombers and fighters. And I just liked the B-26 from the very beginning. And I selected that one, and they let me have it because there were about 300 in my graduating class, and half of the class became co-pilots immediately because everybody is graded wherever they are in the process of training. They get graded by an instructor. The first B-26s were made at a 70-foot wingspan. And when they had a single engine problem, it didn't fly very well. And it killed a lot of training people and their instructors, primarily at McDill Field in Florida at Tampa. However, over the years, they kept adding things to make the B-26 safer. They went from 65 feet to 71 feet. They went from 1,800 horsepower engines to 2,000. And they just made it more powerful and more flyability from a flyability point of view. When we finished training in Dodge City, Kansas, and Dodge City, Kansas was on the Santa Fe Trail, the Arkansas River, and Boot Hill. And Boot Hill had Bat Masterson's, and it was just a wonderful place for training. Anyhow, our instructor had completed 65 missions, and he was born in New York. So at the end of our training, we flew to New York on a leave for him and 3 days for us. And I can recall leaving Dodge City at night and flying to Scott Field, just east of St. Louis, staying there that night, going on to Dayton, Ohio the next day, and then flying into New York. And I can recall flying into Floyd Bennett Field without anybody asking, how soon you're going to land, because there are no airplanes flying in or out. So we just flew right into New York. Spent 4 days there. It was wonderful. I was happy to be able to go to war, but that didn't happen the way I wanted it to, because we formed our crews at Maxwell Field, Alabama, which is in Montgomery. That's where I met my co-pilot, my navigator, engineer, radio man, and tail gunner. Then we went to Lake Charles, Louisiana to train together. Formation training, bombing training, and that sort of training, and more educating on my part about what the airplane was like, what they had to do, what their jobs were. There's a lot of electrical, there's a lot of hydraulics involved in that airplane, and everybody had to understand that. Because we were going to fly the airplanes from Savannah down to Miami Beach and then into northern South America and then from Brazil out to Ascension Island. That's the way we were going to go to Europe. But another pilot and myself got a defective yellow fever shot that led to yellow jaundice, and I wound up in the base hospital in Savannah for 28 days. They sent my crew home on leaves and furloughs, and I didn't see them again until after the 28-day stay in the hospital. And the 28th stay was bed rest, which is not the way they do it today. And at the end of 28 days, I was too weak to fly the airplane. So they took the airplane away, and I didn't get to go the way I wanted to go, because I wanted to fly across out to Ascension Island and then to Africa, Dakar. If you recall, Ascension Islands where the Argentines and the British had a war quite a few years ago, and the British fought that war from from the island. Before getting on the ships, my crew was reassembled in New Jersey, city of New Jersey, very close to the New York Harbor, where we got on the ships in New York Harbor. I like to say there were 70 of them. Huge convoy. When we went to a depot in England, it was called we were not ever going to fly as a crew. We were only in a replacement person. However, my engineer got pneumonia there, and that extended our day another couple of weeks. Finally, a C-47 flew my crew to, we flew to Paris, stayed at the Rothschild estate. Then the next day, another C-47 flew us as a crew to Dijon. And Dijon is close to the Swiss border. But the airfield that I went to was at Dole, on the Dole River, Dole. And I met my major. We joined a squadron there. Well, I was anxious to see what a mission would be like. I was about to find out. And I found out that you're so highly trained when any aircraft starts, you don't pay any attention to it because there's so much to do, because you consolidate your formation so that you would have a very close patch of bombs hitting the ground. Highly trained, you don't pay any attention to the anti-aircraft fire because there's so much to do. You know, we bombed factories from 10 to 14,000 feet. You could see a factory. We bombed railroad yards. We could see those bridges, highway crossings. And when I was in the war, the United States Air Force and the British had pretty much knocked the Nazis out of the air. So the only airplane that I saw of the Germans was a 109, and I saw that at a distance. But we also had escort from P-51s. Mm-hmm. The 88 was the best gun. The German 88 was the best gun in World War II. It was used on the Tiger tank, and it was the anti-aircraft gun. And it had crude radar that, based on our speed, our altitude, and direction, that they could put the anti-aircraft right at our level. My co-pilot and my bombardier and I were debunked from the mission, what we saw, debriefed from the meeting, as to what we thought we saw damage-wise. Was the damage complete? Was it half done? Or did we miss the bridge? Did we miss the factory? Was it a bad mission? Yes, and then we got a drink of straight alcohol in that process as well. After the war ended, as I said, the 12th Air Force went home, and the pilots that were left joined the 9th Air Force at Amiens, France. Later on, I was told to join the trial, the Nuremberg trial at Nuremberg. And we're talking about the first trial. And I didn't know what my assignment was going to be, but I reported to this guy who directed my life. And finally, I got to fly. Oh, by the way, the chief prosecutor for the Americans was a Supreme Court justice when the war started. Harry Truman asked him to be the head prosecutor for the Americans at that trial. In June of 45, he took 57 attorneys with him to Nuremberg because they were going to try 21 Nazis, and each of those had an attorney. And there were a lot of people that had they had to try each individually. So that's why they had all the attorneys. And while they were there, occasionally, when they had a recess or when they had a weekend off, they would want to fly to London, Paris, Brussels. So I was given that job of being in Firth. They would come to Firth and we'd open the Bombay door and they'd get inside, they sit in the Bombay. And my co-pilot would get back in the airplane and we'd fly them to London, Paris, wherever. Spend the weekend there with them. Then on Monday, fly them back to Nuremberg, Monday or Tuesday. It was great. The people being tried were the 21 people who reported directly to Hitler, directly. Some had more clout than others, but they all reported to him. And I was very much taken aback that I was watching history taking place and that I was part of that history. And I was sitting in the area where people like myself could watch the trial. And I was sitting with a number of reporters from all over the world, also there watching the trial. And the trial was conducted so that you could turn a thing and you could listen to Polish, French, English, whatever. There were a number of people translating immediately so that when the prosecutor asked a question in English, it got translated immediately into all other languages. And of course, each Nazi had an attorney of his own. Yeah, I was much impressed looking at Goering and looking at Hess. I knew who they were ahead of time. I knew who the generals were, some of the admirals. I knew who some of the politicians were. Yeah, I'm very much impressed because I was one of the few Americans who would ever have an opportunity to do that. All of the Nazis just sat back and were very calm and quiet. They knew they were going to be hung, and they knew that whatever they said wouldn't make any difference anyhow. And all of them were hung, with the exception of Hess and Ribbentrop. Hess was in now, had been for a long time, because he had really nothing to do with what the Nazis were doing. So he was not to blame for anything. And Ribbentrop was a kind of a Secretary of State. He was not blamed either. Those two survived. They hung all of the others. One of the jobs I had was I was directed to meet with the German transportation officer and the American transportation officer. And I was asked if I would take a troop train from Nuremberg to the cigarette camps along the Atlantic. Well, I didn't have any choice. I had to say yes. So there were 9 troop cars and headed by an engine. And they gave me 2 MPs to give me some help if I needed it. But the MPs were part of the Third Army going home, and they were not of much use. Anyhow, we left Nuremberg late at night, and it was only 75 miles to the Rhine, but it took us 2 days to get to the Rhine because, well, we went about 20 miles the first night. We got off at they called me to the middle of the car where all the officers, they had loaded the car with all kinds of beer, wine, and whiskey, and they were all littered up. So they called me, "Hey, fly boy, get your ass off the train and go into the depot and find out why we stopped." So I would get a lantern with my 2 MPs, go into a half beaten up old train station with a potbelly stove. And I would ask the Germans the German officers who did not speak English, why were we delayed? And they would point to my wings on my chest and point to the sky and say, hey, you were partly to blame for what's happened here. We don't have a straight track between Nuremberg and the Rhine River. Plus, there was only one bridge at the time that we could use. Plus the fact, after the war ended, the Army of Occupation training in the States were coming to Europe. And when the war ended, instead of wanting to kill them like the day before, we wanted to do everything we possibly could for the Germans to rehabilitate them, rebuild their country. They were destitute. They needed food, they needed medicine, they needed everything because the Nazi Party and the German army and the German submarines got everything that they needed at the expense of the German people. Well, yes, coming home, yeah, it brought tears to my eyes to see the Statue of Liberty. I played baseball with 3 other guys, and we stayed together. We stayed at the Roosevelt Hotel downtown in New York, walked around, saw New York City. And then a couple of days after that, I got on a troop train that took me to Fort McCoy, Wisconsin, where I was told that I had been promoted in Europe, but I didn't know it. And that was because I was reporting to 2 different people. So people who do things so wrong, like the Nazis, what they did, not only to their own people, but what they did to the Poles, what they did to the Jews, what they did to the Russians. It set an awareness in my body that if you were bad, you had to pay the price, which they did. And it continues today. We still have more crime today than we ever had before. We can't make them pay time enough for it because the culture that I had is a lot better than the culture you have today. Regrettably, it's so much better. Crime is prevalent today. It wasn't then. You got to start somewhere, and you have to try to make yourself better. You have to educate yourself. You have to have a better relationship, man to man, man to woman. We have to accept people that we didn't want to accept before. We have to do something to make the country better. There's not a lot of people doing that. There are some wonderful people who suffer, the nurses, the doctors, who do all that with the co-ed people. The feed the poor people, all of that. Salvation Army. We need more people like that doing. I think you have to have a better understanding of your mankind. I dislike being called a hero because it's undeserved. We did exactly what we were trained to do. We're not heroes. There were heroes. There were a lot of heroes. But the average guy like me was not a hero who had a great life, had a wonderful wife and mother of her children. I had very good jobs. I did well as a civilian working. This may be one of the best days in retirement. The other best day was when I was 100 years old. And my daughter, my wonderful daughter, who's very bright, smart, a lovely person, put this thing together, put through a birthday party, and we invited 65 people. It was great. And this is a great day for me also. Thank you.